So now that we've tested our starter motor and we know that it works properly and there's no faults or anything like that going on with it, we're ready to reinstall it in the vehicle. So let's go do it. And you do need to remember to reconnect that knock sensor connection before we go too much further. Alright, so now we are good to keep going with this. I've got all my bolts right where everything is. I'm going to clean this one off a little bit. I think it's pretty cruddy. One thing I didn't mention earlier is the fact that a lot of times on older vehicles specifically, you'll end up with a starter shim. And a starter shim is basically a thin piece of metal that lives between the starter housing and the engine block. Sometimes people forget to put them back in. It causes all sorts of issues. As I said earlier, the starter motor's pinion gear and the actual starter motor, and the actual flywheel, they work together. And the relationship between the two has to be a good one. So sometimes through the machining process, that mounting plate where this starter motor attaches isn't the correct distance from the actual flywheel. And a way to fix that, the manufacturers had, was by slipping a very thin piece of metal in between the starter motor and the engine block. By doing so, they solved any sort of engagement or clearance issues that might have been had. The problem is that if you didn't know it was there and you dropped it and you kind of had a messy shop, sometimes you didn't realize you were missing it until you got it all back together and you went to start it and you hear this awful gear noise. And what that meant was you forgot to put the shim in and you had to take it all back apart in order to make sure that it was done properly. Now this particular starter motor actually has a little embossed part of the housing that says, and I don't know if we saw it in the video earlier, but it says no shim. And because it has no shim, that means that the manufacturing tolerances were high enough that it always has a good fit each time, and probably had something to do with changing the relationship of the starter motor and that flywheel in the design phase so that there was less of a concern of having conflict between the gears. Just get this first bolt snugged up here. We're not going to get it tight. Rule of thumb, whenever you're reassembling something and it uses multiple bolts to attach it, never fully tighten any of them until all of the bolts have been at least hand threaded in or started with a tool like we're doing here. If you try to do it too early, you realize as you try to put in that last bolt that this thing's not fitting. The reason why is because you have enough slop around each of the bolt heads to prevent it from actually lining up if you snug it down. Allows the holes to misalign just by a little bit, and that last bolt might not fit. So it is getting supported, just about snug there, but enough room to wiggle around. That's where we're going to leave it until we get that next bolt in here. The next bolt, that was a really long one that goes in the back, and I am not looking forward to getting this thing tightened up. Like I said, this is not going to be a fun time, and actually we're going to have to back this first bolt off because it does need a little bit more wiggle room than what I left on there. So Hopefully just a little ways off. Comes down to like a quarter of an inch, that's going to be frustrating. Oh, nope, there it goes. Alright, bolts are lined up. Go. Get her lined up now. Now I just got to get this one finished off. And she's coming up against some resistance there. We've just about got it. Want one good snug turn on this thing, just like that. Alright, now we're good for the front. Mounting bolt. And that one's good too. So, before we forget, let's get this knock sensor reconnected. Back here. Should hear us click. And there it is. We're going to reattach our positive battery cable connection first, and then on top of that goes the fusible link connection for other vehicle electronics. Just like that. Put the nut on. If I'm making weird faces while I do this, I apologize. I've never recorded myself while working on a vehicle, and so I might be making some really strange faces. Connection on here is, it feels just like a little bit dirty. Might have got some gunk on it as I was installing it. I'm trying to wipe it off right now. Alright, let's get a ratchet on there and start trying to tighten that up. Alright, so it is looking pretty good. Still gotta get that positive connection on there. It's being a little bit of a pain in the butt. So we're gonna just give it a little bit more leverage than I can with my hand. And as long as I got room to do it, I guess. There we go. Must be when we're trying to bridge those terminals while testing. A little bit of that copper threaded bolt on the end must have just got a little bit of gunk on it. Or maybe it melted a little bit. Want to make sure that the cables are staying aligned where they're supposed to be. And then when they actually start to tighten, you don't want them to spin with the nut. You want them to stay as stationary as possible, because you can rip the wires inside the insulation, and that would not be a good time. There we go. Got it just lined up right where we want it. Should be able to do one last final tightening on this thing, and then we'll move on to that little 8mm bolt. This works way better than using that wrench from earlier. Alright, now I gotta hold back on this wire connection so it doesn't spin. But the other thing is, these are just copper, more or less copper bolts. And if you over tighten them, you just made yourself a whole lot more work than what was necessary. If you break them, you can break the plastic end of the starter solenoid and create all sorts of issues there. Alright, time for our 5/16. Now, a lot of times these have lock washers on here so that vibrations don't make them come apart. Don't forego those. The only reason I'm not putting them on this one is because they aren't here and I don't have new ones to replace it. And I just realized what was going on there. And I don't have to worry about any arcing and stuff as I move my wrenches. I've seen people do starters before without disconnecting the battery, and halfway through the job you'll hear a bzz and somebody start screaming something, some obscenities, when they just about melt their screwdriver or wrench to the side of the engine block because they just bridged the positive and the block, which is your ground, and never makes for a good time. Kind of funny to watch them dance around a little bit though, but don't be that guy or girl who makes that mistake. If you've watched the video, you already know better. Alright, so we are installed. That didn't take us too long. Just double check our connections, make sure they're not loose, give them a little wiggle, make sure they're snug. I am going to double check my attachments just one more time to make sure that it is in fact snug and it's not going to go anywhere on me. Oops, another one. right, that one's good. Got that last one. And then all we have to do after this is just reconnect our battery and verify that it starts. All right, very good. Let's move on to the next phase. So you're ready for the last phase. That is reconnecting our battery. We do want to make sure though that before we're done, that any sort of grease or anything that's on the paintwork gets cleaned up. Do remember that battery terminals where I'm attaching this are lead, and as a result you don't want to over tighten it, otherwise you can strip out your battery. And strip out that battery, there are a couple of solutions available, like bigger studs and stuff like that, but it's best if you don't have to deal with that problem. Just avoid it entirely by not over tightening anything here. I'm using a really short wrench on purpose, just so that I don't accidentally over tighten anything. Once I got that good and snug, grab a hold of the cable, make sure it's not too loose. Still got a little bit to go on this one. Before we do any more damage. Now, again, we're working with the ground terminal here, so there's very little concern over sparks or anything like that. So we shouldn't be worried about. Wouldn't be worried about touching this to our ground contacts, just simply because there's no power to flow out of the ground to the chassis. As being a little bit of a pain in the butt. One of the downfalls of working in such a tiny space, it's hard to tell if you got everything lined up properly. I think we got it now. I think it was just a little bit off-centered, and that was stopping us from getting it tightened up nice and square and holding our terminal on. That looks a lot better. So hold your terminal while you tighten it. Make sure you don't twist it in some weird position and stress the cable. Oh yeah, way better. That's not going anywhere now. Just double check while you're in here. Make sure the positive lead is tight. And we are good to go to test. Alright, so here we go. We'll give her a shot. Alright, so that was perfect. Started right away, didn't seem to have any hesitation, turned the engine over very quickly. It's exactly what we're looking for. So, success, we've reinstalled our starter and everything works well. And we expect that. I mean, that's the thing, we did the bench testing to make sure. It would be wise that if you're replacing a starter and you're getting a refurbished unit, to do that bench testing, regardless of whether or not, you know, it's been triple tested like ours. The reality is mistakes are made, and I hate to see somebody go through all the effort of reinstalling that just to find out this doesn't work, and then have to go backwards and remove it and then take it back to the store, save yourself some time and aggravation, and bench test it if you have the opportunity. You don't have to have a jump box to bench test either. You can use jumper cables off of your battery. So there's a couple different directions we can go with it, but for the most part, that's it. From a basic maintenance and light repair standpoint, removing that starter, bench testing it, and putting it back in is a big portion of what we do. We did those videos on starter load testing, and that load test can give us an indicator of whether or not we need to replace a starter because of high current and low engine RPM as you're cranking. So we just went through kind of the final stages of that, taking it out, cleaning up things, making sure all the connections are good, and then putting it back together. So that's it. I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope it was informative, and we'll see you next time.